Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. If you've been joining us for parts 1 and 2, for those of you who are just tuning in, very happy to have you here for part 3 of our Living with Courage series. Today, we're going to talk about infusing courage into work. So we'd love to hear about what you've been thinking about over the past couple of weeks, what you've been experimenting with your relationships, with your conversations. So we welcome you to put some of those thoughts in the chat box. We'll spend about 45 minutes going over some things, and then we'll save about the last 15 minutes to explore what's in the chat box. So please do put your thoughts, your experiences, your revelations, jokes, whatever you'd like in that chat box, and we'll find some time to look at that. Just a reminder for those of you, if you're watching the recorded version of these, or for any of you that have already done so, our wonderful production manager, Trevor, has kept us right on top of the copyright laws. So all of the videos and the poems and other things like that are not in the recorded version, but you can access them by going right under the YouTube, and all of the links for anything that we've referenced in here is there. So if you hear Jim and I say, and now we're going to watch a film clip, if you could pause the recording and then go down and click the link to the film clip and then come back to the recorded version. So that's how that works, just with copyright laws and things like that. So, and finally, for those of you who were here last week, we were wondering if you'd had some time to explore that web of inner being. We worked on your personal web of inner being while we were together last week, and also encourage you to create another web of inner being for your work environment. So we're wondering what that web might have come up in a re-examination of your relationships, either personally or professionally, some that you might want to strengthen, or some that perhaps you need to reevaluate, and you find that the energy is not mutual, going back and forth in that relationship. So again, we encourage you to put as much as you feel comfortable sharing in the chat box so that we can have some conversation at the end of today.
So much a part of what we're exploring these 3 weeks is really the emergence of this truer self. As we said, it's not necessarily the true self, false self thing. Things are not necessarily that black and white, but a truer sense of self. So that's the part of you that's intimately connected to, really your essence, your core being, who you really are. That's the part of you that comes out to play authentically with others, and sometimes has to manage relationships strategically because it's not a place where you can be authentic. And also engages in candid, caring relationships with those at work. And in our connection with the expanse of nature, beyond ourselves, we'll be pulling in a little bit of that later on as we move toward that transcendent, something that brings us into something greater. We talked about this a bit too, this false self that's developed along the way. This is the persona that appeals to others. We use this maybe to mitigate conflict sometimes. And sometimes it just allows us to get through the day with one less headache. But what we're doing all that time is we're creating this false self, and we're selling that to others, that we've talked about. So over time, we might invest a great deal in this less true self, and also invite others to this illusion that this is who we are when it's not. And the longer and more layers that you've been spending time developing this image and presenting it to others, the longer some of this work can take, and that's perfectly normal. So it could be that genial presentation that you have that hides sometimes bitterness, resentment, anger, whatever nasty feelings we all carry with us. It could also be that tough exterior that covers vulnerability. And for some of you, that's going to be the thing, is how do you chip away at that tougher side that maybe, yes, you can have tough conversations, but are you also sacrificing some of the relational aspects there? So we all have something to teach in this process. And, it could be that you're the nice boss who rarely criticizes anyone's work as if you have no taste whatsoever, but you're just too sensitive to the feelings of others. And what we're going to look at is a way to push past that. So both for those on the sensitive side to push past that, and for those on the other side to take the relationship even more into consideration than you do.
The beauty of this process is that as you peel back those layers one at a time and move a little bit closer to your more true self, or your truer self, shall we say, even though there may be some bumps along the way, and there could be even some intermittent pain, because in some ways there's a sense of loss, there's a sense of perhaps loss for you, for this persona that you're kind of slowly fading away, and also for others who know you as that persona that you have developed and shared with them. But as you peel those back and get closer and closer into the authentic you, there's this great joy that comes, and this wonderful peace, and just a feeling of comfort in your own skin, that you are happy, you greet yourself and you smile at the other's image in the mirror, and you're happy with yourself, you're happy with who you are. And then when you share that to others and you have these wonderful friendships, these wonderful relationships where they're like, wow, I like you just the way you are. Flaws, quirks, idiosyncrasies, nuances, things that drive you crazy, but you know what, you're still a really, really cool boss, person, peer, supervisor, friend, companion, and then being able to interchange your authentic self with somebody else's authentic self creates just the most wonderful relationship. Many of us already have those relationships in our lives, and those are the ones that we thicken the line in that web of inner being because we want to cultivate that and keep that going. But what a joy to be able to expand those relationships, both at work and in our personal life.
Gosh, I feel like I should go to my coat closet and pull out my red sweater and I like you just the way you are. But you know, there is something in some really bad moments. I have popped that open. I've never was a big Mr. Rogers fan personally, but you know, there's something really soothing about that, and that sense that he gave to people of that genuinely is pretty amazing. And I don't know if I'm willing to go full Mr. Rogers, but you know, whatever. So you know, we had talked somewhat. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna, you're reminding me to a flashback. I'm showing my age now, but when was it, in the 70s or the 80s? I'm okay, you're okay.
Oh, yes. Yes, the pop psychology book. And I like the other version, I'm okay, you're not okay. That was my favorite.
Of course you would like that version.
So anyway, last week we talked about this whole issue of roles in our lives, and we do play roles. So we're going to challenge you about your current role. You know, if you have a role as a parent, it comes with very specific practical societal expectations, you know, that are in place for good reason, for the safety of the child and the social structure and all that. But when we look at our roles at work, very often we're like, this is my function, this is what I do, I'm a supervisor. We want you to start thinking about your roles differently. Not that you haven't, this is not brand new to any of you, but really take this seriously. Instead of I'm a supervisor, or I'm this or that, I'm a coach, I'm a mentor, a guide, a facilitator, an intellectual partner, and most of all, a human being. Most of all, human being. It came up during one of our, and come up in a video, but one of the things that one of our participants had said from DMAS in some work we were doing with him is, I realized what this is all about. Good leadership is all about becoming a better human being. And it was beautiful, couldn't agree more. Admittedly, sometimes we have to be the boss and we've got to like pull out the badge and say, okay, you know, yes, I'm your supervisor. You're under arrest for failing to do this over and over again. And we have to go through this bureaucratic, awful process. But that should be the last moment. We want to work through every other step along the way for those courageous person-to-person conversations at work. They need not always be confrontive. And we're going to do that, show you a pathway so that it doesn't require as much sweat, you know, and fear and anxiety as it does. And for those of you who, again, have courageous conversations and are really blunt and direct, how do you have these and not lose the person? Linda's got a great story she's going to share about how you can do that sometimes, be right, but miss the ball.
Mm. Yeah, so let's all just pause for a moment and think about sometime in your life, professionally or personally, that maybe someone had a courageous conversation with you, or perhaps you had a courageous conversation with somebody else. And it could either be, you know, it could be a badge conversation, so to speak, or it could have been one that was entered with love and care and more of a kind of a coaching and mentoring philosophy. But one of the ones that really sticks out with me, and I remember when I first shared this with Jim several years ago, it, you know, just almost brought all those emotions back to my face. But this was back when I was working in the world of finance. And it was actually my boss's boss, who was the VP of finance at a higher education university in New York. And even though he was my boss's boss, we worked a lot together. I did special projects for him, and there was a special project that he had put me on, and I had written a summary report for him. And, I was pretty proud of that report. And so I was in a session with my boss and some of my peers, and the VP of finance, he comes in. It didn't help that he also had an English major. And he comes in and he just puts my report out for everybody to see. And it is just covered with red. Yes, this was before track changes. It was the red ink, and not only were many paragraphs just stricken, but there was just all kinds of words in the margin, and exclamation marks and all of this. And my immediate reaction was embarrassment. This was a public shaming in front of my boss and my peers. So embarrassment was the first wave that kind of hit over me. And then after that was disappointment, because I felt like I had disappointed him, had intended to do a good job, had thought that that's what had happened. And then somewhere in there crept motivation, motivation to kind of go back and take a deep breath and pause and take a look at the feedback and do a better job. So I've thought about that story so many times, and it did achieve a result that improved me, not just for that project, but I think forever, in the way that I approached writing, the way that I approached editing and rewriting and rethinking about how I communicated in written format. But at the end of it, there was this feeling of distrust for him. It didn't build our relationship, because I thought, that was a badge move. It was definitely a badge, an authority move. It was a power move. It embarrassed me in front of people that I cared about, and made me question how I should strategically interact with him in the future to prevent another experience like that. So we're going to talk about how we can do this differently. I mean, how can we approach something like that, but from a place of care and growth in the other person, and help the relationship instead of hurt it. Jim, you had an experience that was kind of similar, but came out of that other more loving framework, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, the story, that the humiliation and that sense that we are brought down to the earth, as it were, it can be very painful. But it's not that the VP was wrong in terms of the feedback, but the way it was. And I could just imagine, and it sounds like it's still so, visible to you after all these years, and which is hard. I had a situation where I was in it was a small class, about 10 of us in there, and it was a psychotherapy supervision class, second or third year, with one of my mentors, Ray Craddock. And Ray was just the nicest, warmest guy. He was like a truly grandfatherly figure who was just so loving. And he was just very supportive. And we were presenting cases one day, and I was working with a 12-year-old kid, and we did the standard clinical presentation. So-and-so is a 12-year-old male working with issues of ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, possible conduct disorder. So-and-so, it seemed to resistant to therapy. And Ray, gentle, sweet, loving Ray, whips around, because he was just standing in front of the class, whips around, and he says, "He's not resistant, you're resistant." I wanted to just crawl under the desk. I was thinking, like, in my mind, why are you yelling at me? But I knew it came from a place of love. I knew what he was saying is, you need to think about this, and this is important. In the space of 1 week, in the next session, it was a totally different session. It flipped around. And so I was able to come back to Ray and say, you were right. I was resistant to this process. And if he had just said, "Hey, Jim, you might want to think about this," I would say, "Oh, okay, I'll think about this." But it was the way he did it, knowing that it came from a place of love. And sometimes I think some of our public conversations at work need to be a bit more like this. Always agree with the idea, like in your situation, if you're giving some really detailed, harsh feedback private, but maybe we need to set the culture for teams in a way that is more public, and sometimes involves calling somebody out in public for something that's going on right there and then. It takes a lot of guts, and most leaders that we work with, we hear about this all the time. Oh, I can't do that. And it's like, well, it sets a tone for how things go in that room, in that leadership team that is different. Because if it's handled privately, always, it may be problematic. Once we get obviously to disciplinary action, all that, of course, always private. But there's nothing wrong with being open, honest, and confrontive, but it comes from a place of love. We'll explore that some more, because that's really the critical variable. If it comes from anger, just keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, I mean, these are, can you imagine if somebody did that kind of thing now? It would probably result in, I'm going to go to HR, I'm going to file a grievance on you. You hurt my feelings.
Suck it up, buttercup. Yep.
Exactly. But, as we talk about these conversations, these courageous conversations that either should happen but aren't happening, sometimes it makes me think about, we have a workaround in state government, at least with the folks that are here. And most of you have been through this before, and it's called a 360-degree feedback. It's a way of opening up the door to anonymous feedback for courageous conversations that are not being said. And it works, and it really, really does. But what if we could have those conversations, as Jim said, from a place of care, concern, and love, and not have to have it anonymous once every 2 years on a piece of paper, run through an administrator, I'm putting ourselves out of business for 360s, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we could create a culture, if you could create a culture, maybe not with everyone, but at least with a few, where you could actually have those comments that you wanted to put in the 360, that you could sit down and you could say, hey, I think the world of you. I love working with you. There's just one thing I want to talk about. Maybe we could explore this together. You submitted this and I didn't think it was your best effort. And I was wondering, did you need more time? Did you need more help? Is there something going on? Because this just wasn't what I expected, and that comes from a place of love and care and concern. So we'll see what we can do with that.
Well, we're going to get a great example of this in a Ken Blanchard clip. We just, in fact, used it the other day with a group, but it's just a few minutes long. And when you watch it, just notice his engagement with others, how he expresses himself. It's like watching your sweet grandpa. He reminds me, in fact, of my supervisor, Ray, in some ways. But just look at the energy that he exudes and the philosophy. So simple. And most of us know Ken Blanchard's work. But this is probably, I think, my favorite. Situational leadership is his thing. The research is questionable about that, although Ken was a great researcher early on. But what he does in this clip and how he captures what's really important related to servant leadership that our dear friend, Bill Mims, executes so beautifully. So if we could go ahead and pop that clip in there, and we'll come back and just, that is, I just love that clip. I could watch that over and over for the inspiration. It's so built on those trusting relationships. And so if I have to have a hard conversation with you, that I love you and I care about you. And, we don't use that word. I love that Blanchard is not afraid of the word love. And you've got to have that genuine sense of where that person knows how you feel for them. And that doesn't mean there aren't going to be tense times and struggle with it, but it'll be at least an honest struggle. But his willingness to have the courage to love, I think, is beautiful.
And I love the fact that he talks about starting the day slowly.
Yeah.
We've used the power of the pause many a times for many of the EIs, and it is about that, that pausing and say, what is it that I want today to be? And it's not always about completing the tasks and getting the reports out and everything else, but maybe it is about that interaction with somebody that that you need to have a conversation with, or maybe it's that praise that goes unsaid, just that 2-minute conversation. Wow, you've been working really hard and this is a trying time, and boy, I've really noticed it, and thank you for that. Or, just that intentionality. If we could focus, I think, more on the people and less on the processes and tasks, certainly in a leadership position, we would go a long way to build those relationships and enter the workplace and sprinkle it with some love, which is definitely what we need now more than ever.
It's so true. David White has that concept I love. It's we have our to-do lists, of course, all the time. And he said, we need our not to-do list. And, maybe one of our not to-do items, to use Rick Holcomb's favorite phrase, is I'm not going to get spooled up about things today. I'm not going to lose perspective. I'm not going to react angrily. I'm not going to shorten my life by just getting so anxious and worried about all these things. So he said, start your day. Yeah, you've got your to-do list, but make sure you put a little column there that says, here's my not to-do list. It's a very practical kind of thing. I was doing that this morning on the dog walk. I remember reading all those things. We all get them, the 5 or 10 habits of successful people. Every one of them says, almost without failure, I don't check email first thing in the morning, So that's why I'm not successful, because I check email first thing in the morning. I don't always respond to everything, but I check it. But it's not really where we need to begin our day, especially when you look at Blanchard's model. You're really talking about a whole person. So your physical self, your psychological self, your spiritual self, all of those come into play. And if they don't, then you're leaving part of yourself out of the workplace. And
then you're moving further and further from your truer self, or your whole self, as we're now calling it too. Yeah, and that with this quarantine and the lack of commute, that is one thing that I've been trying to enjoy, is starting the day slower. Just taking that time in the morning, and I glance at the emails, but I don't get back to them right away. But taking that time, and whether it be reading the paper or picking up a book, or just spending time with my aging dog. I mean, I look at him in the morning and just am so thankful that I get this opportunity to be with him. So, and that sets the tone for the day. It really does, is when you have that kind of recentering within yourself. Then for some reason, when the day starts spooling up, so to speak, you can maybe work to spool it down a little bit.
Yeah. The example we're going to show you next is from Sherry Maples, and I think there's something about bringing things to the level of law enforcement. And if you can do this in law enforcement, you can do this at your desk job, or what used to be a desk job, or office desk job, whatever, where you're facing life and death situations. And so Sherry Maples, she died in 2017, secondary to injuries from a cycling accident. And but she worked in law enforcement in Madison, Wisconsin for 20 years. Along the way, she got her MSW, she studied Buddhism. She just really, and she got her JD too. Just absolutely brilliant person, nothing else to do. But she was a police officer on the streets for much of her career. And then eventually she became a captain in charge of training and personnel. So she had a significant role in shaping the department as much as one person can shape it, because you're dealing with not only the culture of the Madison Police Department, but you're dealing with a larger policing culture that influences, every member of the force. But there's a really great interview, and we'd recommend that you go to the full interview, and we'll post that site up. We're just going to play a couple of minutes of this interview. It's really powerful about the applicability of some of these esoteric ideas to our relationships. And I think she provides some valuable guidance. So again, we'll watch just this brief interview with Krista Tippett from On Being, and then we will send you the link to it's like 21 minutes. Definitely every minute's worth it. She was a beautiful human being. That point is so good, because sometimes we can lean into one or the other. And when she talks about combining them and how do they feed each other, it's like knowing how and when to dance just right, and how to adapt to the situation. And to think, again, the challenge for all of us is, if you can do that in law enforcement, how do we transfer that to the office?
And when she talked about being mindful, just like Ken Blanchard, starting your day slowly, being intentional about it, and then as she said, when her energy changed,
Yeah.
the energy of others to her changed. And so it really can be this dynamic. But like with a dance, you know, somebody has to lead the dance and somebody has to follow sometimes. And in this case, she kind of led it, and her heart opened up, and she was able to understand that the behaviors of others were coming out of a place of pain, and maybe they had no one to share that with. Maybe they didn't have people in their web of inner being that would take the time to listen to them. It sounds like she did that. I love the fact too, I mean, she was reluctant to bring it into law enforcement, but she did personally. But then as she moved up through the ranks to be the captain of personnel and training, she then spread this into the culture of the department. And so, you know, we are not just one individual person. We do have we do have the effect of being able to reach out, share our energy with others, create a culture within our own unit, our own division, our own friend network, our own whatever, that comes more from a place of love. She still had her badge, and I'm sure she would use it if she had to use it. But as she said, it was a balance between that compassionate bodhisattva and that fierce bodhisattva, and the ability and the intellect to know that she had to hold both of them and then decide.
Yeah, and to get to that truer self, I think we really have to have that compassion for others and for ourselves, and that fierceness that is willing to be really who we are. It doesn't have to be aggressive, but it can be fiercely strong. I think as she was able to open her heart and see the pain in others, I think how often people in our own offices are filled with pain, but sometimes, and you know, some leaders have told us, well, I don't need to know about what's going on in their personal lives. And you don't want to ever impose yourself on it, but you want to create the space where, you know, I notice things aren't going so well these days. How are you doing? And this is where we shift into just being another human being, person to person. I'm not asking you as my supervisor, I'm asking as a fellow human being. We share this space. And it comes from a spiritual recognition that there isn't an other, there isn't a hierarchy. So wherever, you know, if you come from a religious structure, you know that there is no superior human being. You know, they are all equal. And whether you have a religious structure or not, we have to understand that shared humanity of everything. And I think in our minds, we still carry around a bit of a hierarchy in different ways. And then how do we recognize that we've got to transcend that ego and be there and really be able to create this space for asking if people are okay. We've seen so many managers and leaders start asking their folks now during this COVID time, before we get into the task stuff, how are you doing? How are you feeling? You know, I know you've got the kids at home. I know you've got this stressor and that stressor. And, you know, just really being there for them. And then still saying, I know with all this, I need you to get this done. How can I help you get this done? How can I be a support to you? We still need to get this done. But those few minutes of really listening, of showing empathy, and being truly a humble servant leader to create space for others will earn you trust. It'll earn you understanding because you're coming from where they're coming from. And then it'll also do what Ken Blanchard talks about, clarify the expectations. So you don't have to sacrifice at any of them. And the idea, of course, is to do this as soon as possible. And if you're not doing it already, we're going to have some suggestions on how to start building this culture, as Linda was talking about, as Sherry Maples was doing, to build this culture within your workplace, step at a time, step at a time.
Those are the leaders that we love the most, the ones that walk this earth with humility. They don't think they're any better than anyone else, and they use their role only as needed. They use their relationships, and as Ken said, we're all influencers. We all influence people that we interact with. Thinking of some of our VEI folks that are out there, and one in particular that is in a law enforcement position, couldn't be a more gentler, kinder person who is always putting another before oneself. And those are the leaders that we that we really admire. And we would go up to them and we'd say, oh, you're just so amazing. They'd be like, huh? What? Who? Me? No. Because they're always asking, what can we continue to do to be better?
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking of the interview with John Lewis when he talks about the training that people went through in the movement and the intensity of it as they were preparing for the sit-ins. And they're always taught to be polite, to look people in the eye, so always engaging as a human being, and to remember that that person who's yelling at you, spitting on you, beating you, was once this little baby. And as he says, you know, whatever happened to this little baby along the way, society, the family, whatever, that led them to do this. So the physical, psychological, and spiritual preparation they went through allowed them to meet hate and love and stay the course, to not give in. They were still fierce in not giving in, and they held the line. And that was the strength, as John Lewis termed it, of the beloved community.
Imagine greeting it with love, even though somebody is throwing things at you and spitting at you, but still greeting it with love. Fierceness, continuing to move on, but with love. And reminds me of what Dr. Martin Luther King said, just go love the hell out of them. Just go, but go and love the hell out of them.
Exactly. And that is what we need to do. And along the way, sometimes we need a little bit of encouragement. I think of the mentors that we've had and the mentor we can be to others and encourage them. There's a wonderful section of Lord of the Rings from the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, where Frodo is in possession of the ultimate ring that is above all the others. But of course, with that ring, he is given forewarning of all that is going to happen, all the difficulties he's going to encounter that comes with that responsibility. And that comes with the responsibility that we all have sometimes in our role and in our responsibility to handle that well. So Gandalf is talking with him, and Gandalf is basically spun off of Virgil, Dante's Inferno. He's the guide and gets him to a certain point in his journey. And one of Gandalf's greatest gifts to Frodo is to remind him of who he is. And sometimes that's the gift that we can give to others. And Frodo is basically saying, I wish this had never happened. I wish I didn't have this ring. He wants to get rid of it. And Gandalf says to him, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. That is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. So loving feedback, but also strong mentorship that puts their arm around us and says, carry on.
So we're now going to take some of this esoteric stuff and bring it down, because we know that many of you like to have steps and some suggestions on how we go from one place to another place. So we're just going to put a few tips out there and close on some humor and, of course, a poem. So sit tight. So number one, come to grips with who you are. As we've mentioned in part one and part two, this begins with knowing yourself, knowing, getting yourself closer to that truer self, or that wholer self, that more authentic self, understanding the personas that you put on and slowly trying to move those away and exposing your true self first to you, and then also reaching out. It's a little vulnerable, but reaching out and showing that truer self to others within your personal life and also your work life, realizing that there may be a little bit of some bumps along the way because people's expectations for you may be that other self, but getting closer to your truer self is where it all begins.
The second part of that is then to recognize the ways in which you've compromised who you really are. And this takes some reflection, and it can be anxiety producing, but these are the ways you said you're okay with certain things when you're not. And this is all internal too, all reflective. Don't criticize yourself for adapting. We all had to do that in life. We all, to some degree, were adaptive individuals. We had to survive our family dynamics or work dynamics or whatever. And so we've learned to survive. But what would it be to say, you know, this is how I build myself and it's not really accurate. And just set aside some time to give yourself the chance to have a new start, to recognize that this false self isn't really who you are. And again, don't be critical of yourself, just let it peel back layer by layer.
And 3, as you begin to show your more authentic self to others, remember Mary Oliver's poem, the ankles will be pulling at your ankles to bring you back to more of that false self. So expect some bumps along the way, but keep moving forward, closer to that authentic self that you are, because that's where the joy will be found.
4th is never act out of anger. And this can be difficult, but if we're the boss, then we are more inclined to act out of anger. If we expand our identity of role, we can be the guide, the mentor, the coach. Different kinds of things are called for. And it can be sometimes a difficult, even sometimes a harsh conversation, but it's a conversation that occurs in the context of a relationship, which means that you can get through that conversation. Think back to Linda's example. It wasn't occurring in the context of a good relationship, whereas I was fortunate enough to have that confrontation, which was painful and difficult, but in the context of a trusting, loving relationship.
Next, number 5, when an incident occurs at work, do prepare yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually. Center your reaction from a place of kindness, from a place of love, reminding each other of the mission of your job, why you're really there, and that you care for that person. Enter that conversation from that space of growth, from that compassion.
Finally, or 6 rather, affirm the other, giving them your support, conveying to them that you believe that they are truly capable. It's just that Ken Blanchard moment there, that 1-minute praise. All of us can do better. And so it's that faithfulness that you have in their better self, that person that you see that sometimes they may not see. And many of the people we work with have said that there's been a person or persons in their lives who saw something about them that they didn't even see. Mm-hmm. And they started to believe that and then act on that transformative moment. So think about that for yourself and how you can provide that to others.
And finally, pour yourself a beverage of your choice. At this time of the day, it's coffee or water, but at 5 o'clock, it would definitely be something else. But do reflect upon your accomplishments and where you've come. Take time to be in that, but realize that there will always be more challenges out there. And so it's one step at a time, and just keep going and go love the hell out of them.
So I think we're going to close on a poem. We were going to close on one other clip, but in the interest of time, so we can get to some questions and thoughts in the chat room, please go ahead and put those in there. The clip was going to be from Harold and Maude. So if you haven't seen the film, it's 50 years old this year, which is scary. But Maude is certainly somebody who's a very true self, living that truer self and helping Harold to discover his own truer self. But it's a great film, very, very poignant.
The link will go out to them so you can watch it on their own, and pay attention to some of the last lines in there about being officious.
Yes, exactly.
All right. The poem we're going to close on is from Jane Hirschfield, an American poet, and it's called Decapo. And Decapo, if we have some musicians out there, means from the beginning. So appropriate for this. So I'm gonna go through. It's a short poem and kind of explain where it's coming from, and then I'll read it a second time. So Decapo by Jane Hirschfield. Take the used up heart like a pebble and throw it far out. Soon there is nothing left. Soon the last ripple exhausts itself in the weeds. So think about taking some of those false personas and throwing them far, far out. But yet the ripples come back and they come back. The false self keeps coming back, but eventually the last ripple exhausts itself in the weeds. Returning home, slice carrots, onions, celery. Glaze them in oil before adding the lentils, water, and herbs. Then the roasted chestnuts, a little pepper, the salt. Finish with goat cheese and parsley. Eat. You may do this, I tell you. It is permitted. Begin again the story of your life. So as we cast aside our old self, there's a new self that is emerging, but it can be exhausting. And we might need to re-nourish ourselves spiritually, emotionally, and in this case, she's talking about metaphorically with food, with the comfort of a nice winter lentil stew. You are now permitted to nourish yourself, and to begin anew. So one more time, Decapo. Take the used up heart like a pebble and throw it far out. Soon there is nothing left. Soon the last ripple exhausts itself in the weeds. Returning home, slice carrots, onions, celery, glaze them in oil before adding the lentils, water, and herbs. Then the roasted chestnuts, a little pepper, the salt. Finish with goat cheese and parsley and eat. You may do this, I tell you. It is permitted. Begin again the story of your life.
And isn't that a wonderful invitation to begin again the story of your life? That's the idea of permission. It sounds almost scandalous that we can actually do that. And it's wonderful and delightful. So we're going to just wrap up last bit before noon to respond to any questions or themes that come into the chat room. Trevor, anything that you've got there?
Yes, so we have one question. As a writer, I have had for 35 plus years an alternate self that stems from my byline. At that point, couldn't both personas be equally true?
That's interesting. Well, that would require some mining, but you know, I bet that the byline is probably even closer to the truer self. So they could both be, I agree, both be parts of that truer self. And the two of them have to have a conversation. They can have it though outside of publication. And as long as they're in good conversation with each other, that could work out well. That's an interesting thing though, to really create that. You think about authors who printed under multiple names and why they did, like Stephen King did that and some others, right?
But there's an intentionality here, it sounds like. You know, there is a persona that was purposefully and intentionally created for 35 years and is living, coexisting in a mutuality in a way with one's authentic self. So that is a little bit different from the false selves that we put on because of our role or because we think that that's what others. This sounds like it's a more integrated another self, which could be really fun. That could be fun. It's almost like having an imaginary friend when you were a kid and saying, "Hey, come on out and play."
It is, and with the adaptation, a small A adaptation, you know, that we all have to adapt to each other. You know, we can't live for ourselves entirely. We have to adapt to the needs and moods and vicissitudes of life. But when adaptation becomes a capital A adaptation, that we are always the one adapting, that's when it becomes really dysfunctional and not fair to ourselves, not just to ourselves.
Yeah. A very, very good one. Thank you for putting in the chat. Trevor, do we have anything else?
Yes, so we have a question relating to performance evaluations. They say, when I do performance evaluations, I tell my staff that I will never ambush at the time, but also that performance evaluations are not a one-way street. What do they need me to improve so they can do better? I don't want to be the reason they don't excel, and I can always do better.
Well, performance evaluations typically, as we hear, are a once a year kind of thing that is mandatory and perfunctory. Love the fact that you introduce it as a two-way street. It is just like with that web of interbeing when we have the two lines, and it sounds like, you know, the supervisor to the employee would be thicker and the employee to the supervisor is thinner. So definitely being intentional and communicative about that and saying that this is not just an exercise. Yeah, we're going to fill out the form and we're going to submit it to HR, but let's rethink that this is an opportunity to have a conversation so that I can hear what you need from me, and you can say that, and I can also say what I need from you, so that we're actually mutually learning from each other and growing in performance and in relationship through this. Also, you know, we do suggest that this not just be a once a year conversation, that even though it's a formal thing once a year, that maybe every quarter or a couple of times a year, you know, you sit just down and just have a check-in. You know, how's it going? Are you happy with your project? What's going on out there that you think is interesting that maybe you want to move toward? How can I help you? Are there things that I can do? Are we communicating okay? I mean, it is okay to ask those questions of somebody else. You can't, of course, force them to answer them truthfully, but you can at least open up the door with love and kindness to have that conversation.
I think of some of the folks with whom we've worked who excelled at, the old management by walking around, and they really, they delegated all their work out, but it wasn't like just one-way street that way. They then went around to figure out, what do you need support, resource-wise? That's what my job, do you need extended time on this one? What ways do you want to grow and all that? And so they really were operating almost the entire week as a coach more than anything else. They weren't out on the field throwing the ball, but they're coaching the entire time, supporting. And I just thought, it sounds like a great job. And very often people will say, well, I've got my own work to do, and then I can do this. But actually working through others is exactly, as for many of you, that's where you're at, is working through others more and more, and not having to do as much of your own work, so much as doing the work of relationship. So you're working, you're building, and you're being strategic, and you're being thoughtful, and you're protecting your team, and having to fight some battles, doing your own Lord of the Rings kind of stuff. So, things like that are really important still, and are actually even more important. And, if I feel attended to by the person to whom I report, I have more energy to do what I'm doing. So don't underestimate the psychological and emotional impact that you can have on your team.
We often say you don't have to be your staff's therapist, but you may have to do a little therapy from time to time.
Yes, exactly. And Trevor, I think we have time for one more.
Great. So the last question will be, sometimes when I'm about to have a courageous conversation with a staff person regarding needing to improve, the person seemingly corrects the issue then and there before I address it. I find the need to be very strategic about having these conversations, but I wonder if I should be less concerned and simply have the conversations more often as needed.
I don't know what kind of energy you're putting out, but if I could skip the courageous conversation and just think this through, and the person corrects it, I'm thinking like, wow, that is a superpower for sure. So it's almost like going to the doctor's office and suddenly you feel better, but that is interesting. I would wonder what you're putting out there. I wonder if you're putting out some subtle cues that the staff person is actually reading. When I worked for one person, we were both indirect communicators. She would just kind of suggest something in a way, and I would get it. And so we were really good at speaking indirectly with each other. And I was very attentive to what she was saying and what she wasn't saying. And so it worked great. And then I was on it. So we never really had to have courageous conversations. She just shared some of her desires, her expectations for what we'd be doing. And I was very responsive. And I wonder if this employee is just reading you and getting you. And that's pretty awesome. If you need to have the conversations, great. But if you're doing so through more indirect communication and you're getting the response you want, I don't know. What do you think?
And if the response stays consistent, or it could also be, it also could be a passive aggressive thing. Oh, I'm going to correct it this one time because I know it's coming, and then go right back to the previous way of doing things. So it kind of depends, I guess, but good to think about what you are putting into that conversation, and if they're anticipating what's coming, and then being preventive and proactive so that the conversation never has to occur. It could be a very good thing.
Yeah, I was thinking about, like with Sherry Maples, when she talks about that, it sounds a little woo, but again, law enforcement does give us a little coverage of this, of somebody who's actually working the beat. But that sense of that, putting out a different kind of energy, and think about this, as we are all mammals, we pick up on energy. Sometimes you can see somebody like, a block away, you could feel the energy, good, bad, or whatever, coming towards you, and we exude that. We're creatures who have so much more going on in our brains than we're even consciously aware of sometimes. So, be aware of that energy that you might be putting out there. Try and make it as conscious as possible so that you can have greater access to it. And be aware of the energy that the other person is putting out. But I think what Sherry Maple said was so powerful in terms of really, the result is different. based upon what you're putting out there. Not always, but a lot.
So we want
So
to thank you all for
yes.
being here. We're talking about doing this again in March, and March we should be having a little change of seasons, hopefully a little more warmth, maybe a little more thawing of the pandemic. And so our session in March would probably be more about your connection with the transcendence, with nature, a little bit more spiritual. But we'd love to hear from you if you've enjoyed this and you would like it to continue. If you could just shoot us an email or just communicate with us in some ways, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you all very much for the gift of your time. And it's great to see the messages coming in, and we just really value so much. So it's great to be back in this community again, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. And please never hesitate to reach out to us for anything that we can do to support you. We are a community of public servants and wouldn't have it any other way. So thank you.
Stay well.
Bye-bye, everybody.